The government tries to draw election battle lines over the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme as Big Pharma in the US puts the PBS in its sights. I'm Patricia Karvelas, live from the lands of the Wurundjeri people in Melbourne. Welcome to Afternoon Briefing. The federal government will slash the cost of prescription medicine in Australia if re-elected, pledging Australians will pay no more than $25 for a Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme script. The coalition moved to immediately match the government's pledge, providing bipartisan support after American drug makers sent a letter to the Trump administration arguing the PBS effectively acts as a trade barrier. If the US implements tariffs on drugs, what will that mean for our prices? I'll ask health economist Angela Jackson a little later. US President Donald Trump has floated the idea of the US taking ownership of Ukraine's power plants in a phone call with the nation's president. It was the first conversation since the infamous Oval Office blow-up 3 weeks ago. A peace talk's back on track. We'll talk about all of these issues with the Foreign Minister Penny Wong. And the Prime Minister is expected to rush legislation through Parliament next week to protect Tasmania's salmon industry from a legal challenge over the industry's impact on an endangered fish species. Environment groups are campaigning to ban the industry in Macquarie Harbour in the marginal seat of Braddon, which is home to a critically endangered fish species. Is this going to weaken environmental protection laws? I'll ask the Greens Senator Nick McKinn. Opposition leader Peter Dutton gave a speech at the Lowy Institute today, speaking on a wide range of foreign policy issues. He promised his first international trip, if he wins the election, will be to Washington, D.C. to meet US President Donald Trump. Mr Dutton also repeated his criticism of Australia's consideration of sending peacekeepers to Ukraine, saying money should be better spent on our own defence.
As for peacekeeping, or more likely war-ready troops on the ground, that must be a job for Europe and its more than 500 million population. It's also worth noting that no European nation, including Germany, France or Italy, have made a troop commitment in the way the inexperienced Anthony Albanese has done on our country's behalf. We're facing our own pressure with an ADF recruitment shortfall of 5,000 people. Australia can't afford the multi-billion-dollar sustainment price tag for having troops based in an ill-defined and endless European presence. It's money that we should be spending on the acquisition of guided weapons and other capabilities.
I spoke to the Foreign Minister Penny Wong a short time ago. Minister, welcome to the program.
Good to be with you.
There is a disagreement between you and the coalition on Australia's role in a peacekeeping mission in Ukraine. Peter Dutton has said today that Australia shouldn't be out ahead of where the Europeans are in relation to a border presence with Russia, where there is no United States assurance about providing an overlay. If there is no US security guarantee, would you put boots on the ground?
Look, there's a lot of hypotheticals in that and a lot of ifs. What I'd say is what the Prime Minister said, which is, first, we have an interest in supporting Ukraine. We know that Russia's war is illegal and immoral. We know that it's a breach of the UN Charter, and we know that that international law protects all of us. So we have an interest. The second point the Prime Minister has made is that if there is a request made, we would consider it. That's a very sensible position, and it's a position that I find it interesting that Peter Dutton, who always seems to, where he has a choice, back Australia or pick a political fight, he always chooses picking the political fight.
Are there any boundaries to what we would say yes to, though?
We would, if a request were made, we would consider it. That is a very sensible position. And again, what I'd say is, you know, Mr Dutton, he always wants a fight. It really shows the extent to which he isn't up to the job.
I just want to move to another issue, if we can, on Israel. British Foreign Secretary David Lammy accused Israel of breaking international law before Downing Street then qualified his comments, saying it was only at risk of doing so. Do you think Israel is breaking international law?
Well, first I want to say, PK, Australians are rightly distressed by the ceasefire not holding. Australians are rightly distressed and horrified by the loss of life that we are seeing, including of children. We continue to urge the ceasefire to be observed. We continue to say Hamas should release hostages. We continue to say international humanitarian assistance should flow. And of course, the government has consistently urged all parties, including Israel as a democracy, to comply with international law, including international humanitarian law.
And does it seem that they are complying with international law as you see it?
Look, there are, I think, different roles here. We are not courts and tribunals, and some of those questions go to those issues. But I think it is appropriate for governments to continue to talk about what international law and international humanitarian law means. It means a range of protections for civilians. We should continue to urge all parties, including Israel, to do that. And it is regrettable that we've never seen Mr Dutton talk about those obligations or the importance of international humanitarian law. As I said, we want the ceasefire to hold. We want hostages returned. We want humanitarian aid to flow.
But who's responsible for it not holding?
Well, there's no doubt that Hamas is a terrorist organisation. Hamas engaged in atrocities on October 7th. We know that. We know that Hamas is still holding hostages, and they should return those hostages. What I again would say, I think all Australians have been distressed by the fact that, also many Australians have been distressed by what we have seen, and I think all of us want to try and ensure we don't bring the conflict here. We continue to try and turn the temperature down, not up, and that's certainly the approach the government is taking.
Opposition Leader Peter Dutton has also obviously given a significant speech today, which is why we're talking about some of the things that he said. He said that one of his first acts would be to call Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and affirm Australia's traditional support for Israel. What's your response to that?
Well, first, I think there was one thing Peter Dutton said which I agreed with, which is that past behaviour is a good predictor of future behaviour, and what it confirmed is that Peter Dutton, the man who made fun of the Pacific, who talked about the drums of war, who left a vacuum in the Pacific for others to fill, that he remains lost in our region where Australia's interests lie. Most of our, so many of our interests lie in our region. And again, Mr Dutton, just like Scott Morrison, is lost in our region. This is a man, as opposition leader, I don't think he's visited one Pacific Island country or one Southeast Asian country. What does that tell you about his priorities?
Well, that's an interesting point you make, because he referred today to the US decision to cut aid in the Pacific. He said it was detrimental to the region's collective interests and that Australia should advocate for some of that funding to be restored, and that he would do that if he was in power. Have you already done that?
Can I just say, this is from a bloke who cut aid from the Pacific when he was in government. Can everyone just remember that? He wants us to take him seriously on this now, when he was part of a government that presided over the largest reduction in aid that we have seen, left a vacuum for others to fill, and ensured that Australia's place or position in the Pacific as the partner of choice was lost. I mean, that's Peter Dutton's legacy on the Pacific, and now he hasn't even been there as opposition leader. Now, I've already been upfront that I have asked my department to do an assessment of where the US aid, where a reduction in US aid might be most problematic. I've already asked them to look at this. Of course, we engage with countries of the region and advocate for the region wherever we can.
That's interesting.
But let's not take Peter Dutton too seriously, because he's part of the government that cut aid, and you know what else? He's already said he'll cut foreign aid. So I really don't think he should be taken seriously on this.
It is correct that they cut foreign aid, absolutely. But on that question of, well, it's a fact, right? There was a cut to foreign aid. But on advocacy of your government, you say you've asked the department to do an assessment. Once that assessment is done and you look at the impact, is it about Australia stepping up with more aid, or will you be saying to the US that they need to restore it and making the case?
Oh, look, obviously we'll continue to engage with the US in our region, as we always do. I mean, part of what we do with the United States is in relation to the Pacific, because obviously we have been an ally who is most closely engaged to the Pacific because of who we are, part of the Pacific family, part of the Pacific Islands Forum. Of course we'll continue to do that. But I'm just making this point that the opposition leader has absolutely no credibility when it comes to the Pacific. This is a bloke who made a joke about climate change, remember? Joked about water lapping at the door, something I still hear when I visit the Pacific. He hasn't visited. He continues here to leave on the table, leave on the chopping block aid cuts. The guy, he's not serious, demonstrates yet again, reckless, not up to the job, just not up to the job.
Even UK Labor has cut aid and boosted defence. Is that a strategy or a way forward that you disagree with for our own country?
Look, we've worked hard to steadily increase aid from a very low level, and even if you look at what the UK has done in terms of a proportion of what's called gross national income, in terms of a proportion of that, actually we are still below the reduced amount that the UK has done. I think they're at 0.3, we're about at 0.18. So I make the point, yes, we've gradually sought to increase it. The reduction in the United Kingdom's contribution to aid still leaves them at a higher level than Australia. Now, obviously, in fiscal circumstances, we've had to make decisions about growing that aid budget slowly and steadily. We'll do that. There's one leader, one man who wants to reduce aid funding, and that's Mr Dutton. Okay. And we've seen this movie before, and we know what happened. Right, left a vacuum for some others to fill. The
other thing that he said in terms of foreign affairs today is that he will seek a meeting with Donald Trump in the early days of a coalition government. He's obviously criticised your side of politics for previous comments made about Trump, for allowing us to be vulnerable. Just in terms of what the Prime Minister and your administration, if I can call it that, would do if you were to be re-elected. Will Anthony Albanese go to Washington as his first move if he wins the election?
Well, I tell you what we will continue to do, and that is to stand up for and advocate for Australia's interests, including making it clear to American pharmaceutical companies and that lobby group that Australia's PBS is not up for grabs, which is not up for negotiation, which is what Labor had to do when the Liberals put in place or negotiated the US Free Trade Agreement. It was the Labor Party in opposition that had to protect the PBS. But I would say this about Mr Dutton. You know, he says I would have got it, that he would have got a deal, no question. Australians need to ask, what would he be prepared to give away to get that deal? What would he be prepared to give away? Would he be prepared to give away PBS funding? Would he be prepared to give away things which are core to who we are? Because we know how much the Americanisation of health has appealed previously to Peter Dutton.
Well, they've said no on the PBS so far. I mean, that's been their position,
right,
but I understand the point.
Yep.
Well, like today, that's what he's had to say. I just want to ask you, he's also commented on the Chinese naval flotilla, and I want to read the quote to you. He said it was the weakest, most limp-wristed response you could see from a leader. This is in relation to Anthony Albanese. And frankly, none of these leaders, Liberal or Labor, would have provided the response the Prime Minister did. What do you make of the language? Well, first, we made very clear our views to the Chinese and publicly. We were very upfront about that. Defence put a number of statements out. The Minister for Defence and the Prime Minister and I all gave very public comments about it. And I raised directly with Foreign Minister Wang Yi our concerns about the lack of adequate notice. But in terms of Mr Dutton's choice of language, what I'd say is, you know, this is a bloke who opposed marriage equality, so it's an unsurprising use of language from him. Are you the actual term is, you know, has a historical connotation. Do you think it's offensive language? Well, this is a bloke who opposed marriage equality, so I think people can draw their own conclusions about the term he used. Penny Wong, many thanks for joining us. I know you're a very busy woman. Thank you very much for your time. Good to speak with you. Stay Staying with national security, my next guest has been the head of the Defence and Foreign Affairs Department, the Director General of our spy agency ASIO, and a former ambassador to the United States. And he's my guest this afternoon. Dennis Richardson, welcome to the program.
Yeah, hi there, PK.
Among your many hats you've worn, being the head of Defence and Foreign Affairs, of course, is one of the big ones. What is your view on the Australian government keeping the door open to the idea of joining potential peacekeepers in Ukraine?
It is absolutely what we must do. We should never forget that Russia invaded Ukraine unprovoked. Putin does not believe Ukraine has a right to exist. 18 months ago, some of the people who now say we shouldn't be making a contribution to a peacekeeping force were arguing that the Australian government should be doing more to help Ukraine. If there is a peace agreement and if there are peacekeepers sitting behind that, and that's all agreed as part of a settlement, why wouldn't we take part in that? It wouldn't involve combat troops on the ground, I don't believe. It would probably involve select areas, it may be in selected command areas, logistics, intelligence, etc. It would not involve many people, and it would not at all compromise our own engagement in the region. We should, as a nation, we would have no pride in ourselves and no sense of priority if we weren't prepared to consider that.
That's interesting you frame it in terms of pride and priority. Peter Dutton has today said, and I'm quoting him, that Australia shouldn't be out ahead of where the Europeans are in relation to a border presence with Russia, where there is no United States assurance about providing an overlay of security. Is that a concern?
We aren't out ahead of anyone. We are simply expressed a preparedness to consider a contribution. And I think what the Europeans are doing under British, French and German leadership is perfectly reasonable.
Just make the case, because some people might hear this and think, well, why should we be involved? We're in a different region, we have a different set of interests in our region, and certainly that's an argument being made by Peter Dutton in relation to our own regional security. Why does the other theatre, so far away from us, why is it important for us?
Well, for a start, PK, if we were, I don't think anyone would suggest that we should make a contribution that would in any way dilute or compromise our engagement or prime security interests in the region. No one would suggest that. It's a question of whether we could make some limited and carefully targeted contributions. We've done so on the Indian-Pakistan border in the past. We've done so in Lebanon. We've done so in Cyprus. We've done so in numerous locations around the world since the end of the Second World War. We have a proud history of doing that, and we should continue that. It does not compromise our immediate security priorities in the region.
We are obviously on the cusp of a federal election. There are two very different views being taken by the two major parties. Would you urge Peter Dutton to review his position and be more active in this so-called coalition of the willing?
I would make no suggestion at all to either political leader.
But if you were Prime Minister, is that what you would do?
I'm never going to be Prime Minister. A total hypothetical, PK.
All right, well, I tried. You've certainly provided your strong view, though. You've also been appointed to conduct an urgent top-to-bottom review of the Australian Submarine Agency. Where is that at? Have any of the events of the beginning of the Trump presidency, including, of course, some of these issues we're seeing, changed the outlook for this work that you're doing?
Oh, no doubt the Trump administration brings a degree of uncertainty that wasn't there before, but nothing that's been said by the Trump administration up till now calls into question AUKUS, and I believe that nuclear-powered submarines are very much the path down which we should be going.
There are people who are raising issues around AUKUS, as you know, and saying that AUKUS should be on the table in negotiations. Do you think they should be linked, given we're about to be hit potentially with more tariffs?
I don't see why we would take the initiative in linking them. I note that quite a number of people who are now raising questions about AUKUS have always been opposed to it. So they're simply taking advantage of a Trump administration and the questions around that to pursue an agenda that they had regardless of the outcome of the US election.
There is obviously a big conversation about how we manage this relationship with the United States. You were concerned leading up to the election about what a Trump presidency would mean. Has it been a more radical presidency than you even expected?
Yes, it has, in part. I think there are quite a number of people around President Trump who are ideologically convinced that government not only needs to be changed but needs to be remade, and they also believe that the US's position globally should be remade. President Trump himself, I think, is more of a pragmatist. He's not an ideologue. So how far down those paths he will go, I think, still remains to be seen. We should never forget that President Trump is probably the most extraordinary politician we have seen in any liberal democracy over the past 70 years. That's not a plus or a minus. It's simply an objective statement. He's broken every rule in the book. He won the election convincingly. And we should never underestimate him. The other thing I would say, PK, that you'll be horrified at, and that is if you want to fully understand the dynamics in US politics, you must every day watch some of Fox News. You mightn't like it, you might want to throw bricks at it, but unless you watch some of Fox News, then you'll miss a big part of the dynamic that is engaging at least half the US population.
No, look, I want people to only watch ABC News and particularly afternoon briefing, as you know, but I do think it's important that we hear all perspectives to be able to make some measured judgments about what's going on. So I agree with your broad statement, not too much time, but enough to dabble. So how should we deal with this tariff dilemma? Because we're about to be hit with more tariffs, it seems. What do we do?
Well, first of all, I don't think... I agree with two previous successes in Washington, Arthur Sinodinos and Joe Hockey. I don't believe any Australian government could have got an exemption for the tariffs imposed on our aluminium and steel exports to the US. Going forward, in terms of what might happen on the 2nd of April, quite obviously pharmaceuticals are off the table, and they should be. I went to the United States in mid-2005. 2 weeks after I got there, Prime Minister Howard arrived. That was not long after the free trade agreement had been signed, and during Prime Minister Howard's visit in mid-2005, the senior Republican congressional leadership made strong representations to Prime Minister Howard to revisit the pharmaceutical issues. Prime Minister Howard did not budge a millimetre, and that's where we should be today, and it's where I think both sides of Australian politics will be.
Does that mean, though, inevitably we may be hit with some tariffs on our own exports of pharmaceuticals?
It is possible, but our expenditure on health in this country is, as a percentage of GDP, is half that of the US. That is primarily because of the high cost structure that the US has in health, and we should not follow the US down that path, regardless of what might be threatened.
It's a very interesting point you make. I know that it's a very well-loved part of our system that we are able to deliver medicines to people at affordable prices. Look, we're also having a conversation about the level of defence spending in this country and whether it's high enough. Former Labor leader and Defence Minister Kim Beazley actually was on the program, I think it was just last week, arguing that we should go up to 3%. Do you agree? Absolutely.
Kim is right. The former Chief of the Defence Force, Angus Hewson, has argued similarly. If we're going to have nuclear-powered submarines, as I believe we should, and at the same time retain and enhance other defence capability that is essential, as we move through the 2030s, we're going to need to lift defence spending to 3% plus of GDP. Obviously, that is not something that can be done immediately because of other budgetary pressures, but as we move forward, that is something that I think we have to do. Do you think the election campaign is the right place to have that conversation? Well, election campaign, we have conversations about everything. You know, it'll be a free-for-all in whatever area the political leaders like to take it. Preferably, it would be done outside an election context. However, it's a democracy, and so be it. Just finally, there's been this idea about trying to strip dual citizens of their Australian citizenship if they've committed serious crimes. Now, of course, there's been a lot of attempts to try and, change the law around this. The High Court seems to have a view that it's not for ministers to do. Would you support a referendum for us to do such a thing? I'd be puzzled as to why anyone would want to take a referendum forward on that question. 25 years ago or more, when dual citizenship was being considered, I in fact argued against it. I still don't particularly like it. However, that's a separate issue. We now have dual citizenship. Many Australians have dual citizenship, and I think to be kicking people out of the country on the basis that they've committed a crime here when they're also an Australian citizen, I think is quite wrong. Dennis Richardson, you know I always enjoy talking to you. Thanks for coming on the show. Pleasure, PK. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese says he expects new laws protecting Tasmania's controversial salmon farming industry to pass the Parliament. Now, environment groups are campaigning to ban the industry in Macquarie Harbour, in the marginal seat of Braddon, which is home to a critically endangered fish species. There's been angry reaction to the Prime Minister's move, some of which has come from the Greens Senator Nick McKim, who is one half of my political panel alongside Labor Senator Marielle Smith. Welcome to both of you.
Thanks, PK.
Seems that Tasmanian salmon is becoming a big issue and the Prime Minister's trying to step in here. Marielle, did the government always intend to amend the EPBC Act to wedge the coalition, or what are you doing here? Why are you trying to pass these laws through next week?
Well, it's always been the government's position, PK, that we can have a sustainable industry and protect good quality jobs in Tasmania whilst also protecting our environment. And every effort of the government has been towards that end, including our investment of $37 million towards protecting the skate, but also in standing up for Tasmanian jobs. So, I understand there's legislation coming before the Parliament next week, which, seeks to provide even greater security, but it's to that end, a sustainable industry, preserving jobs and protecting our environment.
But this smacks of being pretty desperate before an election, doesn't it? Well, Parliament wasn't even meant to go back. The Prime Minister was going to call an election. What's this rush about? Is it just about shoring up seats in Tasmania?
Well, my understanding is there's been a lot of insecurity surrounding these issues, and that insecurity has a big impact on workers in the industry. When your industry is insecure, you're not sure or worried about your job, that has a big impact on people, as does the insecurity around the environmental question too. And we've always maintained that we think it's possible and preferable to have a sustainable industry with preservation for the local environment, but also supporting local jobs. Anne Urquhart, our candidate there, has been advocating for these things very, very strongly, as you'd expect of a Labor Tasmanian senator, and the Prime Minister standing by that and standing by this industry too.
Nick McKim, it's a huge issue. The industry is very concerned and saying that there'll be lots of job losses. Isn't the Prime Minister's intervention necessary to maintain an industry that so many people rely on in Tasmania?
No, it's not. And with the greatest of respect, what a load of rubbish that we've just heard. Let's be really clear about what the salmon industry is doing in Tasmania. It is driving an ancient, iconic fish species into extinction. That species only lives in Macquarie Harbour, and there are probably less than 100 adults of breeding age left anywhere else in the world. That species has survived quite nicely, thank you, for countless millennia until the salmon farming corporations got their hooks into the marine environment in Macquarie Harbour. In southeastern Tasmania, where there's been millions of fish die in the last few weeks, you can't go swimming at many local beaches without bumping into rotten, stinking, diseased salmon carcasses. When you go for a walk on the beach, your feet are covered with this congealed, rotting, stinking, fatty mess that is being emanated from the piles of dead salmon inside these cages. This is a toxic industry that is polluting our marine environment, destroying social amenity and driving a species into extinction because of the animal cruelty that is a foundational part of its business model. Tasmanians have had a gutful of this. The Greens have had a gutful on it, and we're going to fight every single step of the way against this legislation. Remember, PK, Labor came to government promising to strengthen environmental laws in Tasmania. The fossil fuel corporations rang the Prime Minister and prevented Labor from an agreement with the Greens that would have done that. And now the foreign multinational salmon farming corporations have got their hooks into a gutless Prime Minister, and he is dancing to their tune, promising to weaken Australia's environment laws to protect profits of multinational corporations which are going offshore, and they are paying no tax here. It is a disgrace.
So it's clear the Greens won't support the Prime Minister's attempt in the Senate. So I'll throw it back to you, Marielle. It means that you need the Coalition's support. Are you going to be providing the legislation to them so that you get their support?
Well, we'll see the legislation, of course, before we vote on it, PK, and that will happen in due course. I haven't seen it myself at this stage. But look, we're, as the Labor Party, unashamedly about supporting jobs, high quality, well-paid jobs for the Australian people. Now, we believe we can do that, support an industry which matters to Tasmanians, and also invest and support a sustainable industry, support the local environment, and continue our fight to protect endangered species in Australia. As I said, there's been significant investments made in this area and towards the skate as well. But we do stand up for Australian jobs, unashamedly, as the Labor movement. This legislation will come before us in due course, and I'm sure the Prime Minister, as he always does, will consult very widely on it.
I just want to go to the issue around the PBS. Obviously today an announcement to keep medicines cheaper, which has been announced. But at the same time, we've got the United States and the pharmaceutical lobby, Big Pharma lobbying the Trump administration to basically punish us for the regime we have. Marielle, to you first. We don't have a Coalition representative today on the panel, so I'm just going to put to you that, there's this kind of argument being put forward by Labor that perhaps the Coalition would negotiate on the PBS with the Trump administration, but in fact the Coalition has made it quite clear that they don't want the PBS touched either. Isn't that the view of all politicians that I can find in Australia now?
Well, first of all, PK, you're right. This is a really big announcement today, bringing the cost of PBS medicines down to $25 a script. That's going to make a massive difference in my community, where we know, sadly, that there are people not filling their scripts because of the cost of them. And we've been fighting tooth and nail to bring costs in our healthcare system down, to make it more accessible and affordable to Australians, because that's in our DNA in the Labor Party. And in terms of the Coalition's position on these things, I mean, I think your viewers know there's a big difference between what people say and what they do. I mean, Peter Dutton was voted the worst healthcare minister on record by GPs. They promised no cuts to healthcare, but he tried to rip $50 billion out of public hospitals.
When Big Pharma tried to do this in the past, the Coalition didn't allow for it to happen and stood up to previous administrations, right?
Well, because Labor fought for it at the time, yes.
All right, Nick McKim, aren't you pleased to hear that everyone's on the same side, it seems to me, which is don't touch the PBS?
Look, absolutely, and we've welcomed the announcement today, but seriously, if Labor wanted to do something meaningful for Medicare and something really, really significant for people who are struggling everywhere they go with cost of living, including with healthcare costs, they should put dental into Medicare. We could comfortably afford it if we made ultra-wealthy billionaires and big corporations pay their fair share of tax, and dental into Medicare would be a genuine intergenerational legacy proposal and legacy announcement by Labor. Instead of filling at the margins, let's fill the gaping hole in Medicare, because last time I looked, your mouth was part of your body and it absolutely should be covered by Medicare.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's marginal. Medicine prices do matter a lot to people, but I get the broader point for sure.
Well, PK, can I just say, sorry, I mean, your womb also is, and we've just invested $500 million in women's health, which I don't think is fiddling at the margins. You know, women have been telling us that when it comes to their pain and their health, they feel dismissed and unheard. And we've just announced a massive package to try to turn that around, including cheaper MHT, cheaper contraceptions, more time with your doctor as a woman, not to mention all the investments we're making in the private healthcare system, including $8 billion to fund 18 million bulk billed appointments and 50 new urgent care clinics. This is not fiddling around the edges. This is massive reform of our healthcare system after a decade of coalition neglect. Of course, there is more to do, and Labor can be trusted with Medicare, trusted with the PBS, because we built these things and we're fighting tooth and nail to continue to improve them, including for women.
Now, we're about to go into an election period, and we know during elections all sorts of stuff gets made, particularly for social media. I want to talk about this particularly unusual video that the Australian Labor Party has put on Instagram to sell the PBS scheme. A journalist tried to ask the Prime Minister about it earlier. Didn't really get very far, but let's just take a quick look at it. Marielle, what's that about?
I'm sorry, PK, I can't see your screen.
Okay.
I haven't seen this clip, so I'm not actually sure.
Do I have to describe it?
What you're talking about, I'm sorry.
It's kind of like there's a woman, and Sabrina Carpenter, thank you, and she opens her towel and she's obviously wearing some skimpy outfit, but it's a Medicare card. It's a little bit off, especially after you just mentioned women. Seems a little off, a little tone deaf.
Oh, look, I'm not sure, PK, as I haven't seen it, but I mean, I think everyone's trying to spread this news because it's really going to matter to the Australian people. I haven't seen this clip, so I'm sorry I can't comment on that. But,
our viewers just got to see it. Nick McKim, are you across the social video?
I just saw it then. That is objectifying women. That should be pulled immediately. That kind of objectification of women has no place in Australian politics. I mean, we've just heard Marielle quite rightly talk about some of the really nice, significant announcements that have been made around women's health, and those, of course, were supported by the Greens. But Labor should pull that straight away. That's just not on.
All right, we're out of time, but thank you to both of you. And I am sorry, Marielle, you couldn't see the video, but maybe we've saved your eyes. Thank you.
Thanks, PK.
Both the government and the opposition today have presented a united front on the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme after American drug makers sent a letter to the Trump administration arguing the PBS effectively acts as a trade barrier and urging the president to target Australia in the next round of tariffs.
We'll stand our ground. This is not for sale and is not up for negotiation. This is a part of the free trade agreement because Labor insisted as a condition of our support for the free trade agreement.
I want the Australian people to know that I will stand up and defend the PBS, which is the envy of the world, against any attempt to undermine its integrity, including by major pharmaceutical companies. We will work with our most important ally, the United States, but we will fight against any big drug company imposing tariffs on our PBS.
Well, the government, of course, announced today will slash the cost of prescription medicine in Australia if re-elected, pledging Australians will not pay more than $25 for a Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme script. The coalition was quick to match the pledge, but we haven't heard their costings yet. Let's bring in Angela Jackson, who's an economist with a background in health particularly. Welcome.
Thanks, Patricia.
What did you think of the video?
I couldn't see it either because I need glasses, so I couldn't see it. But yeah, apologies for that.
It's all right. Look, you know, women of our age, we need glasses, don't we?
Something to, you've caught me out.
I need you to help me understand why the PBS is such a big deal. For our viewers who've heard a lot in the last couple of days about the PBS, what does the Australian government do that's so unique that everyone thinks is such a big deal?
Well, it's actually not that unique, but we were the first to do it. So back in 1992, we've had the PBS, of course, since about 1948. So we've been able to access, as Australians, pharmaceuticals, and the federal government's provided subsidies. And it's really important, right? Because, these drugs can be exceptionally expensive, and if people need them and it makes their health better, then this provides it to them in a way that's accessible. In 1992, we're going now back to the Keating government, of course, or Hawke Keating government, we introduced what we call health technology assessments. Now, we were world leading in this, and what we said was, look, we're only going to fund these drugs and we're going to assess whether these drugs represent value for money and whether they're cost effective or not. And we led the way. Now, what happened subsequently was everyone else caught on. So the Europeans now do it, the UK does it, the Canadians do it. And this might be why the American pharmaceutical companies are particularly sensitive about us, because we really did show the world, how you can fund a universal PBS or pharmaceuticals in a cost-effective way that's sustainable. And of course they don't like it because it means they get less for their drugs, and it means they only get funded for drugs that we determined are in fact cost-effective and represent value for money.
Right, so we use the buying power at that sort of big macro Australia level to play hardball on prices.
Partly, but also what drugs we fund. So we don't fund everything. So they might come up with a new drug in a particular class to treat, say, diabetes, and what we may do is assess that actually, compared to what we currently have in terms of treatments, that's not cost effective. It might be a little bit better, but in terms of the price that you want for it, it's not worth us purchasing it. So we might not purchase it at all. And then we might play hardball on the price that we might pay. Well, if you lower your price, then suddenly it becomes cost effective for us to pay for this new drug. And so what it means is, yes, we get access to lower cost drugs, but also we're only funding things that are actually cost effective for the Australian taxpayers. Now, the Americans don't like it on a couple of reasons, I think. There's an ideological reason here too, and it's one of the reasons they don't like universal healthcare. It's their biggest argument, in fact, against universal healthcare, is this idea of you only get access to things that are cost effective. Under the US system, of course, they fund everything, whether it's effective or not, and that means they pay a lot more overall for their healthcare spending.
Okay, so this is now going to be the next front potentially of a trade dispute between Australia and the US. What options are available to the Australian government? If we stare them down, and both sides of politics have said today that that's what they intend to do, to say, no, this is what we're going to continue to do. What could they retaliate with that could damage us?
Well, I mean, what they're talking about is tariffs, obviously, and broad-based tariffs across Australian imports into the US. So in terms of pharmaceuticals, we're only talking about $1.5 billion. I mean, it's something, but it's not the world in terms of our export dollars. But more broadly, I think what we're looking at and what the US is looking at is, broad-based tariffs of between 2 and maybe 10% on all imports into the US. Now, that would hurt, particularly sort of our agricultural imports into the US, and that would hurt our economy. Our direct exposure isn't huge though, and I think a lot of economists have talked about this. I think we're very caught up in Trump and what he's doing, but in terms of Australia's economy, China's obviously the main game. So for us, the impact of these tariffs and Trump's policies is really more through what impact it then has on China.
Yeah, that's an interesting view, and I've heard it a lot from experts that is the message you're trying to send, calm down, we're not that trade exposed when it comes to the US directly?
Yeah, exactly. Look, it is a big deal. Like, obviously, we've got, the world's biggest economy is becoming increasingly sort of nationalistic in its approach, and it's walking away from free trade and international cooperation. And that is a big deal. And the extent to which that impacts China and global economic growth, and we have an international trade war, that is a big deal. But in terms of the direct exposure, we don't have to sweat the small stuff, I don't think. It's more the big picture of what this means for generally globalisation and what it means for economic growth more broadly, rather than the direct impact on Australia.
Going to today's announcement, which is the Albanese government saying they're making basically cheaper medicines, even cheaper, $25 $25,000. $25. Please don't charge anyone $25,000. $25 basically for a script. Just explain to me the economics of that. Is this just extra taxpayer money going to reduce the prices for consumers?
Look, yes, effectively. So we have a co-payment on our Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme. So every time you fill a script, even though maybe the cost of the medicine's $500, $600, you pay at the moment $31 something, I can't remember the exact cents, to fill that script. That's going to reduce to $25. So look, from a health economics perspective, there's a cost associated with it. I think it's around $600 million over the 4 years. But there are benefits. So we know that, making people pay more reduces adherence to drugs, so people are less likely to take them. And in Australia, the latest stats are that around 8% of Australians aren't filling scripts because of cost. So the extent to which it helps with that, it may well reduce costs more broadly. But there is a fiscal challenge afoot, which obviously we're going to be talking about a lot in the next week, in terms of, where the budget sits and the size of the deficit and how this all adds up in the long term. And I think there's probably some concern out there that, we're seeing a lot of spending without much being talked about how we're actually going to pay for it.
That's absolutely the problem. I mean, I don't know anyone who doesn't like the idea of cheaper medicines, especially given we do have some pretty profound issues. But we haven't explained how we're going to pay for it. Neither side has articulated that. The coalition has said, yep, we're going to match that promise. They too haven't explained, but neither has the government. It's just borrowed money at this stage, isn't it?
Yeah, and look, we might not want to sweat every single announcement, but I think in the macro picture, we've obviously got a structural deficit, and it's only going to get worse with an ageing population, and we're not really having that conversation about, well, how do we make revenue match to the spending that we want to make? And these investments are important, and they will improve welfare. It's not something you would oppose necessarily, but there is that broader conversation I think that we're not having at the moment.
The Treasurer put some figures around how trade exposed we might be, and they've done a lot of modelling and so forth. He's given a speech this week, and it seems that the message is, look, things are very uncertain. The message is that we don't really know what's going to happen. Is that the truth, that actually no one can really model for what we don't know is coming?
Well, look, I think what's happening in the US is, there's a lot of uncertainty. We're seeing that in markets and it's getting priced in. We don't really know where Trump is going. It's definitely a change, and, I'm trying to not listen, and then today I have to listen again. There's a lot of change. Every time you turn on the news, there's something new. We don't really know where it is going to end up at the moment. I think it is a lot of uncertainty, and that makes I guess, the government's job and the Reserve Bank's job in terms of managing the macroeconomy more difficult. They have to be a bit more cautious. Because, it may well be that we are going to have sort of a economic shock, if you like, and Trump certainly is a bit of a shock to the system. And where it all ends up, we're going to have to wait and see. It's kind of like you're riding the waves of his thought bubbles at the moment, and I think everyone's a bit jittery as a result.
Just a question completely without notice. I know you've got a job also at the Productivity Commission, and working from home, it's completely not on our agenda, but I just need to pick your brain about this. I've recorded today the Party Room podcast, and tomorrow we're putting out a special episode of People's Questions. And someone asked this fantastic question, which was, with this working from home proposal for people who are in the Commonwealth Public Service, is this a way of getting people to leave the public service? And I wondered, do you think that if you don't provide a working from home at the same level, that it does lead to people shopping around for jobs? Does it have a material impact on whether women, for instance, want to stay in a job if it's not flexible?
Look, I think we've certainly seen, in that post-COVID period, since working from home has become more widely available, women's female participation has increased across the board, and that's been a real economic boost, right? There's no doubt female participation.
You work more, you pay more taxes.
Exactly. And the federal budget's going to reap the benefits next Tuesday from that. So yes, there is going to be that competition within companies. And obviously employers, the government is an important employer in the market. I guess the concern about the Commonwealth going down this path is, does that then change the entire dynamic of the labour market and what's considered the norm? And do other businesses then think they can follow suit? But certainly we're seeing, businesses compete with each other over flexibility. Workers like it. The evidence shows that this hybrid model of sort of 3 days, in the office and maybe 2 days at home is a bit of a sweet spot in terms of productivity, and particularly for women and families more generally, it allows that juggle, which allows both parties to work full time and to their full capacity. So, look, we'll wait and see what actually happens, and whether, when you look at it a bit more closely, we'll see what happens, I think, post-election.
Yeah, really. Thank you for taking my question with that notice.
Thank you, that's fine.
I knew you could handle it. Thank you. Shadow Treasurer Angus Taylor was forced to abandon a press conference in Sydney today after anti-nuclear protesters interrupted him as he was speaking to reporters. The protesters are from the Rising Tide Climate Group, and one of the men also interrupted Peter Dutton's Lowy speech earlier today. Here they were.
Prices we learned this week, grocery prices up 30%, grocery prices up 30%.
I'm just wondering, why are you asking taxpayers?
We're just doing a press conference.
But why are you asking taxpayers?
At the moment.
Why are you asking taxpayers to fund billions of dollars towards nuclear power when it's going to drive up energy costs?
Let's do the press conference and let's have a chat afterwards.
But with respect, I feel like Australians deserve an answer to this. You're talking about the cost of living, and this is a policy, flagship policy. Billions and billions of dollars that you're asking taxpayers to fund.
Happy to have a chat with you afterwards.
Mr. Taylor, your own party is campaigning against nuclear power. It's not even a Liberal Party policy.
We'll do a press conference somewhere else where we can actually get some plenty. I'm very happy to have a chat with you afterwards. More than
why not have it on the record, Mr. Taylor?
Well, your own party has campaigning against nuclear policy. The Liberals against nuclear policy. Well, it's a fair question.
Well,
like,
guys, we're doing a press conference, and one of the things about
against itself on its flagship policy.
We have a chat and
I mean, you don't seem to be able to answer a simple question. It's a flagship policy.
Perhaps that's going to be something we see a little more of during the election campaign. Let's find out with the national political lead for the ABC and Insiders host, David Spears. Hi, David.
Hi, PK.
Is that happened twice today, really? Because Peter Dutton was also interrupted at his Lowy speech. It seems that the anti-nuclear campaigners are becoming very active.
And it happened the other day to Jim Chalmers, the Treasurer, PK, when he was at the Queensland Media Club delivering his big pre-budget speech as well. And I think it was the same organisation, but with a rising tide, but with an anti-coal message for the Labor Party, for the Treasurer. And they also managed to get on stage and physically quite close to the Treasurer as well, as you saw similarly to Angus Taylor, the Shadow Treasurer there today. Look, we live in a democracy, a free democracy, and protest is absolutely, a part of that, and that's an important part of our democracy. But there are a couple of things when you do see a press conference unable to go ahead and journalists unable to interrogate politicians. That's an issue. But also, I think the personal safety element of this as well. When protesters do get right up to physically right up to a politician, like we saw with Jim Chalmers the other day and Angus Taylor there, you can imagine that would be unsettling. They don't all have the protective security detail around them like a Prime Minister or an opposition leader does. We don't necessarily want to be in the situation where every politician needs that sort of close personal protection around them. So look, all of these things do require a balance. I'm not criticising here. I thought both Angus Taylor, Peter Dutton, Jim Chalmers the other day were all pretty calm in how they reacted to this, and you could see it there, Angus Taylor not wanting to blow this up into a bigger deal. But it would be a concern personally for politicians, you can be sure, heading into a campaign.
Yeah, it was handled well. It is a difficult thing to happen. Okay, so today A couple of things have happened. Let's start on the PBS. The Prime Minister promising cheaper medicines. Barely had the announcement happened, the Coalition had again said, we'll do that too. This is a bit of a theme, isn't it, when it comes to health now?
It is a theme. Run through the list. We had the big one, the bulk billing incentive expansion, backed in immediately by the Coalition. The women's health announcement, backed in immediately by the Coalition. This one on cheaper medicines, backed in immediately by the Coalition. Look, throw into the mix over recent weeks and months, Bruce Highway funding, wireless steel funding. You know, the Coalition aren't standing in the way of this. Why? Look, I'm sure they'd argue that they fully support these sorts of spending areas, but they don't want to fight on them, is the bottom line. They don't want... The government is trying to generate an argument over health and make that a focus of the election campaign, and Peter Dutton's not having a bar of that. He's willing to back through all of these spending areas. Now, does that contradict some of the Coalition's rhetoric over the past few years about too much spending? That's what's the problem causing inflation. Yes, it does, but we're 5 minutes to an election, and clearly he does not want to be the one accused of being too miserly when it comes to looking after health.
For sure. Now, the other big dominant story today has been essentially foreign affairs and the different positions being taken by the major parties, which is unusual. Historically, we've seen much more unity on foreign affairs. Peter Dutton, the opposition leader, gave a big speech at the Lowy Institute, and we got a bit of a response before from Penny Wong in relation to that. Just give me a sense of where he differentiated and the government's response.
Look, I think, you know, we've always had the accusation from Peter Dutton that Anthony Albanese's been too weak on China, and he's used that recent circumnavigation by the Chinese warships to make that point. But where you do actually have a foreign policy split, it's over the idea that we might consider sending peacekeepers to Ukraine. Look, we've had foreign policy splits in the past over the Iraq War deployment, for example, most notably. But you're right, we don't see it all that often. And I thought it was interesting, Dennis Richardson, very well credentialed former head of ASIO, Foreign Affairs, Defence, former ambassador to the US, highly respected. He has said we absolutely should be part of this. It would not involve combat troops on the ground on the front line. He's talking about a modest logistical or intelligence effort. As I reported on Sunday, it might even include just continuing with the training that we're doing of Ukrainian forces currently in UK, but maybe you could do that elsewhere, maybe even in Ukraine. It's not going to be, Australia sending a division of troops over there, was Dennis Richardson's point. And look, we have supported Ukraine. We should continue to support Ukraine. So I thought that was an interesting intervention there. But Peter Dutton's argument is we should have every troop, by the sounds of it, focused here on protecting the mainland and focused on the region. So, look, it will be interesting to see how the ceasefire talks progress and whether a peacekeeping force does get off the ground that Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron are trying to generate. But Australia is at the moment part of those discussions, and yeah, we'll just see where they go.
And on foreign aid spending and the US's cuts to foreign aid, particularly affecting our region, Peter Dutton also said today he'd advocate for the restoration of some of it. I put that to Penny Wong, and you could just hear pretty much the sort of arguments Labor will make against Peter Dutton, mentioning that foreign aid cuts actually that affected our region happened under previous coalition government, and talking about his role in this region as well, really trying to really make a case for that he hasn't been lifting enough in our own region.
Look, Peter Dutton and the Coalition are talking about increasing defence spending with an announcement to come before the election as to how far and how fast they would increase defence spending. They've left open whether they would cut foreign aid to pay for it in the way that Keir Starmer, the British Labor Prime Minister, has done. Quite a significant reduction in foreign aid to fund the defence spending increase. But the Coalition here have indicated that wouldn't affect the Pacific. They totally value the role that foreign aid is playing in the Pacific and in terms of our relationships in the Pacific. And of course, the unspoken part of that is if we dial that down, then China's only going to dial up what they're doing in the Pacific, and that's going to hurt us strategically. So, look, I think there's an awareness in the Coalition that they can't they can't cut foreign aid in the Pacific. And I thought it was interesting that Peter Dutton said that's something he would lobby Trump over, is to restore some of that US foreign aid in the Pacific as well. I'm sure the Albanese government would say they would. Well,
they've already
do that too.
Yeah. Penny Wong said she's commissioned a review about how it's affecting the region, and that's obviously what they're working on as well. It's a good point. Just final in our last minute together, David, immigration on its way down. That's the piece of information that's come out. The net migration intake has fallen. Obviously, there's still some issues, but that is probably an important piece of news for Labor as they've faced this criticism that immigration was getting too high.
Probably hasn't come down as much as they would like. Nonetheless, a relief for the government. We know this has been something they thought would happen sooner, but the post-COVID problem has been not just those incoming, but more acutely those leaving. Those numbers haven't been as high as the government expected or would like. So it will be happier to see that number falling. Will it take the heat out of this issue completely? No. You can be sure that Peter Dutton will be focusing. He's already pledged to bring permanent migration down to 140,000 for next year and the year after, and he will be absolutely hammering that point through the campaign. Yeah, he sure will. David, you know I love talking to you. Thanks for coming on. Thanks, PK. And that's afternoon briefing for today. Stay with us here on the ABC News channel. Joe O'Brien is up next with today's top stories. And if you can't get enough of politics, the Politics Now podcast is out right now. Today's Party Room episode looks at all of these issues as well. So if you're about to do a commute, that's the perfect thing to look at. We are on iView. Our afternoon briefing is how you find us if you want to search for us in iView. Stay with us here on the ABC News channel. I'll see you tomorrow.